Flight to freedom. Riley Thorneheart pressed her hand against her still flat stomach as Air India Flight 171 taxied down the runway in Mumbai. The pregnancy test hidden in her carry-on felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, 2 pink lines that had shattered her world 6 weeks after Marcus Blackwood destroyed it. The rejection ceremony still haunted her dreams. Standing before the pack council, Marcus had looked right through her as if she were nothing. "I, Marcus Blackwood, reject you, Riley Thorneheart, as my mate. I choose a bond that will strengthen our pack's future." The formal words had torn through their mate bond like claws through silk. Riley had collapsed, her wolf howling in agony as every cell in her body screamed at the severing of their connection. 3 days in the pack hospital, fighting for her life as the bond bled out of her soul. But she'd survived. Broken, scarred, but alive. And now she was carrying the child of the man who'd thrown her away for perfect Bella Hammond, beta-born, politically connected, capable of giving him suitable heirs, without the shame of being bonded to an Omega. "Ma'am, we're beginning our descent into Delhi," the flight attendant announced. "Please ensure your seatbelt is securely fastened." Riley nodded, adjusting the belt carefully. In a few hours, she'd catch her connecting flight to Vancouver where her cousin Emma waited with open arms and no judgment. A fresh start where being an Omega didn't define her worth. The elderly woman beside her was knitting something soft and yellow. "For my newest grandchild," she explained with a warm smile. "My daughter just had a baby girl. They're calling her Priya, it means beloved." Riley's throat tightened. "That's beautiful. Children are such gifts," the woman continued, her needles clicking rhythmically. "No matter how they come to us. No matter how they come to us." Riley wanted to believe that, wanted to think love would be enough to raise this baby alone. But fear sat cold in her stomach alongside the morning sickness. What if Marcus was right? What if she really was too weak, too broken? The plane began to shake. At first, it felt like normal turbulence, the kind that made nervous flyers grip their armrests. But then came the sound that would haunt Riley forever, a grinding, metallic screech followed by a bang so loud it seemed to split the world in half. The lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in hellish red. Oxygen masks dropped like yellow flowers blooming in the darkness. "This is your captain speaking," crackled through the intercom, barely audible over screaming wind. "We've experienced engine failure and are attempting an emergency landing. Please assume the brace position." The announcement cut off in static. People were screaming now, praying in a dozen languages. The elderly woman clutched her knitting needles like a rosary, lips moving in silent prayer. Across the aisle, a businessman cried into his phone, trying to say goodbye. Riley pulled the oxygen mask over her face with shaking hands and pressed both palms to her stomach. "Hold on, baby," she whispered. "Hold on." The plane lurched, spinning as it fell. Through her window, she saw nothing but white, snow, clouds, and endless Canadian wilderness rushing up to meet them. In that moment, she understood with crystal clarity that they weren't going to make it to any airport. They were going to crash. The first contraction hit her just as the plane began to break apart. Pain ripped through her abdomen, different from terror, sharper, more urgent. No. Not now. It was too early. But her body didn't care about timing. Another contraction followed, then another, each one stealing her breath as the plane continued its deadly descent. "Help," she gasped, but her voice was lost in chaos. The woman beside her was unconscious, blood trickling from her forehead. The businessman wasn't moving at all. The plane hit the ground with the force of a meteor. Metal screamed, glass shattered, seats tore loose and became projectiles. Riley felt something sharp slice across her ribs, felt warmth spreading across her skin, but through it all she kept her arms wrapped around her middle. When the plane finally stopped moving, the silence was almost worse than the noise. Riley tried to move and gasped as pain shot through her left leg. Broken, probably. Around her, the cabin was a twisted nightmare of metal and shadows. Most of the other passengers were too still, their bodies bent at impossible angles. Another contraction gripped her, and this time she felt something wet and warm between her legs. Her water breaking. No, she whimpered, but her body had already decided. This baby was coming whether she was ready or not, whether it was safe or not. She was alone in the wreckage, about to give birth to a child who might not survive the night. But as another contraction built, stronger than the last, Riley Thorneheart made a choice. She might be broken, bleeding, and dying in the middle of nowhere, but she would bring this baby into the world. She would love it for however long she had left. She would not let Marcus's rejection define the end of her story. The next contraction brought her daughter into the world with a cry that cut through the silence like a blade of pure life. The Alpha King's Hunt. For Alpha Axel Grayson, the hunt was everything. For 34 years, he had ruled the Northern Territories with an iron fist and claws that never missed their mark. Even his own pack, hardened warriors who had fought beside him for decades, still stepped carefully in his presence, their wolves whimpering when his eyes went cold. Today, he was tracking elk in the deep wilderness with his most trusted betas. It was a ritual that kept his beast satisfied, kept the predator in him from turning its attention to less appropriate prey. Politics were necessary, but they didn't feed the savage hunger that lived in his chest. The hunt did. He was crouched beside the tracks of a massive bull elk when the scent hit him like a physical blow. Moonflowers. Sweet and haunting, the kind of scent that belonged to dreams. But underneath it, desperation so sharp it made his teeth ache. And something else, something that made every instinct snap to attention. Omega. But not just any Omega. This scent sang to something primal in him, something that had been sleeping so long he'd thought it was dead. His beast threw back its head and howled inside his mind, a sound of pure, possessive hunger. Alpha. His beta, Logan Mercer, approached cautiously. He'd served Axel for 15 years and knew better than most how quickly his mood could turn deadly. You've gone still as death. What is it? Axel's nostrils flared as he lifted his head, following the scent like a bloodhound. It was coming from the north, maybe 5 miles away. And there was something wrong with it, pain and blood and the copper tang of death mixing with that intoxicating moonflower sweetness. Something's happened, he said, his voice rougher than intended. Something that requires our immediate attention. He was already moving, his long legs eating up distance at inhuman speed. Behind him, he could hear his hunting party scrambling to keep up, but he didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. Whatever was calling to him was in trouble, and every second they delayed felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The scent grew stronger as they ran, and with it came other smells that made his beast snarl with rage. Jet fuel. Burning electronics. The metallic reek of twisted metal. And death. They crested a ridge, and there it was, a scar of devastation carved into the pristine wilderness. The aircraft had carved a path through the trees before coming to rest in a clearing, its body broken and smoking. Even from this distance, Axel could smell the death clinging to the wreckage. But underneath it all, that moonflower scent still called to him. Jesus Christ, Logan breathed behind him. There's no way anyone survived that. Axel was already sprinting down the slope, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he didn't recognize. His beast was clawing at his control, demanding to be released, demanding to find the source of that scent and claim it before death could steal it away. The main cabin was a twisted maze of metal and debris. Most of the passengers were clearly beyond help, their sense already fading into stillness. But there, in what had once been the middle section, that moonflower scent bloomed stronger. Axel followed it like a man possessed, tearing through debris with his bare hands, his enhanced strength making quick work of obstacles that would have stopped a human. And then he saw her. She was crumpled against a partially collapsed seat, her dark hair matted with blood, her clothes torn and stained. But it was the bundle pressed against her chest that made his world tilt on its axis. A baby. Not just any baby, but a newborn so fresh the scent of birth still clung to them both. The tiny thing was crying, weak, mewing sounds that spoke of cold and hunger and desperate need for warmth. And the woman holding her. Axel dropped to his knees beside them, his hands hovering over the woman's face as he tried to process what he was seeing. She was beautiful in the way wild things were beautiful, all sharp angles and fierce defiance even in unconsciousness. But more than that, she was his. Every instinct he possessed was screaming it. His beast was pacing behind his ribs like a caged animal, throwing itself against his control with violence that left him breathless. The scent of her, moonflowers and Omega and something uniquely hers, was like a drug he'd never known he was addicted to. Mine, his beast snarled. Mine, mine, mine. Alpha. Logan had caught up, his voice carefully neutral in the way that meant he was trying very hard not to provoke anything. Is she alive? Axel managed a nod, his voice coming out as barely more than a growl. He could see the faint flutter of her pulse, could hear the shallow whisper of her breathing. But she was fading, blood loss and shock and cold working together to steal her away from him. He would not allow it. With infinite care, he slipped his arms beneath her and the baby, lifting them both against his chest. The moment she was pressed against him, something inside his chest seemed to settle into place like a lock finding its key. The baby's cries quieted to soft whimpers, as if even in her newborn state she could sense safety. You need to step back, he told Logan without looking at him, his voice gone deadly quiet, the tone that preceded violence. Axel, Logan said carefully, you need to think about this. She's clearly been with another alpha. That baby proves it. The political implications alone. I said step back. The words came out as a snarl that made Logan's wolf whimper in submission. Even the other betas who had caught up took several instinctive steps backward, their survival instincts screaming at them to give their alpha space. Because Axel's eyes had gone pure silver, the color they only turned when his beast was riding him hard. And right now, his beast was very close to the surface, very close to deciding that anyone who came between him and the unconscious Omega in his arms was a threat that needed to be eliminated. She's mine, he said simply, and the words carried the weight of absolute law. They're both mine. He could smell the fear on his betas now, sharp and acrid in the cold air. Good. They should be afraid. They had no idea what he was capable of when something truly belonged to him. The baby stirred against his chest, and he looked down to see eyes the color of storm clouds looking up at him with a focus that seemed impossible for something so new to the world. She wasn't crying anymore, just studying him with an intensity that made his heart do something strange in his chest. Hello, little moon, he murmured, his voice gone soft in a way that would have shocked anyone who knew him. I'm going to take care of you now. The woman, his Omega, his mind insisted with fierce possessiveness, made a small sound of distress. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of deep forest shadow. For a moment, she just stared at him in confusion, as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. My baby, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Is my baby safe? She's safe, Axel said immediately. You both are. Something in his tone must have convinced her, because the tension in her body eased fractionally. Her eyes drifted closed again, but not before he saw something that made his beast roar with rage. Fear. She was afraid of him. Not surprising, given what he was, but it still made him want to find whoever had put that fear in her eyes and tear them apart with his bare hands. He could smell another alpha on her, faded now, but still there. The scent of rejection and abandonment clung to her like smoke. Someone had thrown her away. Some fool had looked at this perfect creature and decided she wasn't worth keeping. Their loss. His gain. Logan, he said, his tone brooking no argument. Clear the fastest route back to the fortress. I want our healer ready and waiting when we arrive. Axel, you need to consider. I need to consider nothing. His voice cracked like a whip across the clearing. She's injured and the baby needs immediate medical attention. Everything else is secondary. He was already moving, carrying his precious cargo with the kind of care usually reserved for priceless artifacts. The woman was so small and his arms, so fragile. It awakened every protective instinct he possessed, and some he hadn't known existed. As they made their way through the snow toward home, Axel's mind was already racing ahead, planning and strategizing. There would be questions, certainly. Political ramifications that would ripple through pack society like stones thrown into still water. Other alphas who would see his claim as either an opportunity or a threat. He didn't care. He'd spent his entire adult life being what others needed him to be, the ruthless alpha king who kept peace through strength and fear. He had given up any hope of finding his true mate decades ago, had accepted that his destiny was to rule alone until the day he died. But now everything had changed. The Omega in his arms was his. The baby pressed against his chest was his. And he would burn the world down before he let anyone take them from him. Home, he murmured against the woman's hair, breathing in that intoxicating moonflower scent. I'm taking you home. Claimed by the king. The Nightfall fortress rose from the mountainside like something carved from nightmares and ancient stone. Even unconscious, Riley seemed to sense its oppressive presence. Her breathing grew more labored as they approached the massive gates, and the baby in Axel's arms began to fuss with increasing urgency. Easy, he murmured against Riley's temple, his voice pitched low and soothing. But there was nothing gentle about the way his arms tightened around them both, nothing soft about the predatory satisfaction that gleamed in his silver eyes as he carried his prizes through the entrance to his domain. The pack members who had gathered in the courtyard took one look at their alpha's face and melted away like mist. Word had already spread, Axel Grayson had claimed something, and everyone with half a brain knew better than to get in his way when he was in full possession mode. Sarah Blackthorne, the pack's healer, was waiting in the tower's highest room, her medical supplies already laid out with military precision. She was one of the few people who could speak freely to Axel, a privilege earned through decades of stitching him back together after battles and keeping his secrets when lesser wolves would have buckled under the weight of them. On the bed, she commanded without preamble, her dark eyes taking in the blood-soaked state of her new patients. And step back so I can work. Axel's jaw clenched. I'm not leaving. I didn't say leave. I said step back, unless you want your hovering to interfere with their care. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse. His beast was riding him hard, every instinct screaming at him to maintain physical contact with what belonged to him. But then the baby's cries grew weaker, more distressed, and something in his chest twisted painfully. He placed them on the bed with infinite care but retreated only far enough that Sarah could work, his eyes never leaving them, tracking every breath and flutter of movement as if his vigilance alone could keep death at bay. Christ, Sarah breathed as she began her examination. What happened to her? Plane crash, Axel said shortly. She gave birth in the wreckage. Sarah's hand stilled for a moment. This baby is barely hours old, and she's been through trauma that would kill most adults. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much death to harbor many illusions. The miracle isn't that they survived, it's that they're both still fighting. She worked in efficient silence for several minutes, cleaning wounds and checking vitals. The baby, Luna, his mind whispered possessively, was surprisingly strong for something so small. Her lungs were clear, her reflexes good. A fighter, like her mother. But when Sarah turned her attention to Riley, her expression grew troubled. Axel, she said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. What exactly do you know about this woman? What I need to know, his tone warned against pressing, but Sarah had never been one to back down from a challenge. Look at her shoulder, she said, pulling back the blood-stained fabric to reveal a mark that made Axel's beast roar with rage. It was a rejection scar, the kind that formed when an alpha formally severed a mating bond. But this wasn't clean or properly healed. The edges were ragged and infected, the skin around it mottled with unnatural discoloration. This is weeks old, Sarah continued, her voice carefully neutral, and it was done wrong. Deliberately wrong. Someone wanted this to hurt as much as possible. Axel's claws extended involuntarily, puncturing the stone floor where his hands were braced. Explain. When an alpha rejects a mate properly, there's usually some attempt to minimize the psychological damage. This, she gestured to the festering wound, this was meant to break her. And it nearly worked. Sarah's examination grew more thorough, and with each discovery, Axel's fury grew. Evidence of systematic cruelty written across Riley's skin, old bruises that spoke of rough handling, stress marks that indicated chronic fear, and underlying it all, the spiritual damage that came from being thrown away by someone who was supposed to protect her. Her wolf is barely there, Sarah said finally, sitting back on her heels. I can sense it, but it's diminished. Traumatized. The rejection was bad enough, but carrying and delivering that baby in her condition should have killed her. But it didn't, Axel's voice was deadly quiet. No. Which means she's stronger than whoever hurt her gave her credit for. Sarah's eyes found his, and in them he saw a warning. But she's also more fragile than she appears. This kind of damage doesn't heal quickly, and it doesn't heal without the right kind of care. The right kind of care. The words echoed in Axel's mind as Sarah finished her work and left him alone with his sleeping treasures. What did he know about caring for anything beyond the brutal requirements of leadership? His world was built on strength and dominance, on the understanding that only the powerful survived. But looking at Riley's pale face and the way she unconsciously curled herself around the baby even in sleep, something shifted in his chest. She was his now, marked by his protection if not yet by his claim. And what belonged to Axel Grayson was maintained in perfect condition. He would heal her, because perfection was the only acceptable state for his possessions. Riley woke to the sound of a crackling fire and the scent of cedar and winter storms. For a moment, she lay still, trying to process what she was experiencing. Soft sheets instead of twisted metal. Warmth instead of bitter cold. The gentle weight of a baby sleeping on her chest instead of the crushing certainty that they were both going to die. Luna. Her daughter was alive. She sat up carefully, her body protesting every movement. They were in a tower room with windows that looked out over an endless expanse of wilderness. The furnishings were expensive but austere, everything built for function rather than comfort. It felt like a fortress. Or a prison. You're awake. The voice came from the shadows near the fireplace, and Riley's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice, had heard the stories whispered around pack fires and in the safety of locked rooms. Axel Grayson, the Alpha King whose territory stretched across the northern reaches like a sprawling empire. Whose justice was swift and brutal and absolute. Whose interest in anything was usually a death sentence. He stepped into the light, and Riley felt her breath catch. He was everything the stories claimed and more, tall enough to dwarf most men, with shoulders that spoke of violence and strength. His hair was dark as winter nights, his eyes the color of fresh steel. But it was the way he moved that truly frightened her, like a predator that had never learned to doubt its own supremacy. Where are we? She managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Safe. He approached the bed with careful steps, and she noticed he kept his hands visible, as if he understood that his very presence was a threat. My fortress. My territory. No one can hurt you here. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like shackles closing around her wrists. I need to leave, she said, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. I have a cousin in Vancouver. She's expecting me. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. You're in no condition to travel. Neither is the baby. Luna, the correction slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted drawing his attention to her daughter. Her name is Luna. Luna, he repeated, and the way he said it, like he was tasting something precious, made her skin crawl. A beautiful name for a beautiful child. Thank you for helping us, Riley said carefully, but we really should go. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden. His tone was final, absolute. You're under my protection now. The word protection sounded more like possession the way he said it, and Riley felt panic begin to claw at her throat. She just escaped one alpha who treated her like property. She wouldn't, let herself fall into the same trap again. I appreciate that, but... You're not leaving. The words hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and unmistakable. Riley stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. I'm sorry. You heard me. He moved closer to the bed, and every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run. You're weak, injured, and caring for a newborn. Leaving would be suicide. That's my choice to make. No, he said simply. It's not. The casual certainty in his voice was more terrifying than any threat could have been. This wasn't a man who made idle statements or engaged in pointless arguments. When Axel Grayson said something, it became reality through sheer force of will. You can't keep me here, she said, but even to her own ears the protest sounded weak. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. Can't I? Luna stirred against her chest, making soft mewing sounds that meant she was hungry. Riley looked down at her daughter, so small, so helpless, and felt the fight drain out of her. What choice did she have? She was weak as a kitten, had no money, no resources, no pack to call for help. And Luna needed stability, needed care that Riley couldn't provide on her own. At least not yet. The baby's father, Axel said, settling into a chair that gave him a perfect view of the bed. Tell me about him. Riley's blood turned to ice. She could smell his suspicion, could see the predatory focus in his eyes as he waited for her answer. If he knew about Marcus, knew that she was carrying another Alpha's child. He was human, she lied, keeping her eyes fixed on Luna's sleeping face. A mistake. He's not in the picture anymore. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. When she finally risked a glance at his face, what she saw there made her stomach clench with fear. He knew she was lying. Human, he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. Yes. Interesting. He leaned back in his chair, but there was nothing relaxed about his posture. Because that baby smells like pack. Like alpha bloodlines. Riley's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? His head tilted slightly, and in that gesture she saw the predator beneath the civilized veneer. You're lying to me, little Omega. And we both know it. Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Axel's expression shifted to one of barely controlled violence. Enter, he called, his voice carrying a warning that whoever was interrupting had better have a good reason. Logan Mercer stepped into the room, his face carefully blank. Alpha, we need to talk. We're talking now. Axel didn't take his eyes off Riley, and she felt pinned beneath his gaze like a butterfly under glass. Privately, Logan said, and something in his tone made Axel's attention snap to him. 5 minutes, Axel said to Riley, rising from his chair with fluid grace. Then we finish our conversation. The promise in his words made her blood run cold. As the two men stepped into the hallway, she caught fragments of their hushed conversation. Words like, political suicide, and, war, and, another Alpha's mate. When Axel returned, his face was a mask of cold fury. My beta is concerned, he said, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. He thinks harboring another Alpha's rejected mate could cause problems. Start wars. Riley's mouth went dry. I don't know what. Let them come. His voice cut through her denial like a blade. I'll paint the territory with their blood before I give up what's mine. The casual violence in his tone, the absolute certainty that he would kill anyone who tried to take her from him, should have terrified her. Instead, some treacherous part of her, the part that had been broken by rejection and abandonment, whispered that maybe, just maybe, being claimed by someone who would fight for her wasn't the worst fate in the world. Even if that someone was the most dangerous Alpha alive. Shadows of the past. 3 days passed in the tower room, and Riley began to understand that her captivity was as gilded as it was absolute. Axel provided everything she could need: soft clothes that fit perfectly, meals that arrived at precisely the right times, a cradle for Luna carved from what looked like a single piece of ancient oak. But the door remained locked, and when she tested the windows, she found them reinforced with steel that would have challenged even an alpha's strength. She was a prisoner in paradise, and her jailer visited her with the regularity of clockwork. Every morning at dawn, he would appear with breakfast, his silver eyes cataloguing her condition with clinical precision. Every evening, he would sit in that damned chair and ask the same questions about Luna's father, each inquiry a little sharper than the last. Riley held to her story like a lifeline. Human. One night stand. Not important. But she could see in his eyes that he didn't believe a word of it. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Riley was nursing Luna by the window when she heard voices in the courtyard below. Male voices, raised in anger, and one she recognized with a spike of terror that made her milk dry up instantly. Marcus Blackwood. Her former mate stood in the center of Axel's stronghold like he owned it, flanked by 6 of his best warriors. Even from 4 stories up, she could see the arrogant tilt of his head, the way he postured like a man who'd never been denied anything in his life. "I know she's here, Grayson." His voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "Return what belongs to me, and there won't be bloodshed." Riley's hands shook as she pulled Luna closer to her chest. The baby whimpered, sensing her mother's distress, and Riley forced herself to breathe slowly. "Calm. Stay calm. He can't hurt you here." But even as she thought it, she remembered his words during the rejection ceremony: "If you ever try to take anything that belongs to me, I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." The tower door opened without ceremony, and Axel entered with the predatory grace that marked all his movements. But today, there was something different about him. Something colder. His eyes weren't silver anymore, they were pure winter, pale and merciless as a killing frost. "Your former mate has come calling," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "Interesting man. Very, insistent about his property rights." Riley's throat went dry. "I don't know what he told you, but—" Forever Moon. 6 months later, Riley stood in the same tower window where she'd first watched Axel destroy Marcus Blackwood's claim on her life. But now, instead of fear and uncertainty, she felt only peace. Luna gurgled happily in her arms, no longer the fragile newborn born in blood and chaos, but a healthy, thriving baby with storm-gray eyes and an infectious laugh. She had grown strong in the safety of the Nightfall Fortress, surrounded by pack members who had quickly learned to adore their Alpha's unexpected daughter. "There's my girls," Axel's voice came from behind her, warm with affection that still made Riley's heart flutter. Even after all these months, she sometimes couldn't believe this was real, that she was loved, cherished, protected by the most powerful Alpha in the Northern Territories. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a chest that had become her safe harbor. Luna squealed with delight at the sight of her father, because that's what Axel was now, in every way that mattered. He had adopted her formally, given her his name and his protection. Luna Grayson. It had a nice ring to it. "How did the pack meeting go?" Riley asked, leaning into his embrace. "Boring," Axel murmured against her hair. "Territory disputes and trade negotiations. Though there was one interesting piece of news." "Oh. Marcus Blackwood has been stripped of his Alpha status. His pack voted him out last week." There was no triumph in Axel's voice, only mild interest. Marcus had become irrelevant to their lives, a footnote in their love story. Riley felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was distant, muted. The woman who had fled Marcus's rejection felt like a stranger now. She had been forged anew in the fires of Axel's devotion, rebuilt stronger than before. "Good," was all she said. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their territory. Their home. Riley had never imagined she could feel so settled, so complete. The mating bond between them had healed more than just her broken heart, it had restored her wolf, her sense of self, her ability to trust in tomorrow. "I have something for you," Axel said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of nervousness that was completely at odds with his usual confidence. Riley turned in his arms, raising an eyebrow. "The Alpha King, nervous? Should I be worried?" "Maybe." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "We never had a proper courting, never did things the traditional way. I claimed you out of necessity, and you accepted me for survival. But I want you to know that what I feel for you, what we've built together, it's real. It's forever." Riley's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a ring unlike anything she'd ever seen. The band was wrought from what looked like silver moonlight, and set in the center was a stone that captured the aurora, all greens and blues and purples shifting like living light. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's moon opal," Axel said, his voice soft. "Found only in the deepest parts of our territory, where the northern lights touch the earth. Like you, it's rare and precious and impossible to replicate." He dropped to one knee, right there in their tower room, with Luna babbling happily between them. "Riley Thorneheart Grayson," he said formally, "will you marry me? Not because circumstances forced our hands, not because of pack politics or survival, but because I love you. Because I can't imagine my life without you and Luna in it. Because you are my true mate, my perfect match, my forever moon." Tears streamed down Riley's face as she looked at this man who had saved her life and rebuilt her world. 6 months ago, she had been running from a broken heart and an uncertain future. Now she was home. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Axel slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, of course it did. Everything about their bond was perfect, from the way they complemented each other's strengths to the way they had become a family without even trying. Luna chose that moment to reach for her father, demanding attention with the imperious attitude of a true alpha princess. Axel scooped her up, spinning her around until she shrieked with laughter. "What do you think, little moon?" he asked her seriously. "Should we make this official? Should we have a wedding that'll make every pack in the territory green with envy?" Luna babbled something that sounded suspiciously like agreement, clapping her tiny hands together. "She approves," Riley laughed, wiping at her tears. "Though I think she's more excited about the cake than the ceremony. Smart girl. Takes after her mother." They spent the evening planning their future, a spring wedding under the full moon, with the entire pack as witnesses. Luna would be their flower girl, toddling down the aisle in a dress the color of starlight. They would exchange vows ancient and modern, binding themselves not just in the eyes of their pack but in the sight of the moon goddess herself. As the night deepened and Luna finally surrendered to sleep, Riley and Axel found themselves back at the window, looking out over their domain. The northern lights were dancing tonight, painting the sky in impossible colors. "Do you ever regret it?" Riley asked quietly. "Taking on a broken Omega and her baby? The political complications, the challenges to your authority?" Axel was quiet for a long moment, his arms tightening around her. "Do you know what I regret?" he said finally. "I regret that I didn't find you sooner. I regret that you had to suffer through rejection and fear and believing you weren't worthy of love. I regret that Luna's first breath was drawn in chaos instead of safety." He turned her in his arms, cupping her face in his hands. "But I don't regret a single moment since I caught your scent in that wreckage. You saved me, Riley. I was becoming something cold and hollow, ruling through fear instead of love. You and Luna brought light back into my world. We saved each other," Riley whispered, standing on her toes to kiss him. The kiss tasted like forever, like promises kept and dreams fulfilled. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, silver eyes meeting green in perfect understanding. "Come to bed, little moon," Axel murmured against her lips. "We have a wedding to plan, a territory to run, and a daughter to raise. But tonight, we have each other." Riley let him lead her away from the window, away from the past that had brought them together through pain and loss. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new joys to discover as a family. But tonight, in the safety of their tower room with Luna sleeping peacefully in her cradle and the northern lights blessing their union, Riley Thorneheart Grayson was exactly where she belonged. In the arms of the Alpha King who had claimed her heart, healed her soul, and promised her forever. 1 year later. The Nightfall Fortress had been transformed for the wedding of the century. Every surface gleamed with silver and white decorations, and the great hall could barely contain the assembled guests, alphas and their mates from across the northern territories, all come to witness the union of their king and his rescued queen. Riley stood before the ancient altar, wearing a gown that seemed to be woven from moonbeams themselves. The moon opal engagement ring sparkled on her finger, but it was nothing compared to the joy that radiated from her face. Beside her, Luna toddled in her starlight dress, clutching a basket of silver petals and looking every inch the alpha princess she was destined to become. At 18 months old, she already showed signs of her father's strength and her mother's fierce independence. Axel waited at the altar in formal ceremonial robes, but his eyes were only for his bride and daughter. The man who had once been called the ruthless Alpha King now looked like what he truly was, a male utterly devoted to his family. The ceremony was beautiful, ancient words spoken under the full moon's blessing. When they exchanged rings and sealed their bond with a kiss that made the assembled crowd cheer, Riley felt the last of her old wounds finally heal completely. She was no longer the broken Omega who had fled in desperation. She was the Luna Queen of the Northern Territories, mother to an Alpha Princess, mate to the most powerful male in the region. But more than that, she was loved. Completely, utterly, eternally loved. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Luna riding proudly on her father's shoulders, Riley caught sight of the empty chairs that had been reserved for Marcus and his delegation. He had been invited, protocol demanded it, but he had declined to attend. Some said he had become a rogue, wandering the borderlands with no pack to call his own. Others whispered that he had gone mad, driven insane by the loss of everything he had once held dear. Riley found she didn't care. Marcus Blackwood belonged to her past, and her future was walking beside her, silver eyes bright with love and promise. The celebration lasted until dawn, but eventually the guests departed and the decorations were cleared away. The Nightfall Fortress returned to its usual rhythms, but something fundamental had changed. It was no longer just a seat of power, it was a home, filled with laughter and love and the sound of little feet running through the halls. Years passed. Luna grew into a strong, confident young woman who commanded respect from every alpha in the territory. She had her mother's fierce heart and her father's strategic mind, tempered by the love that surrounded her from birth. Riley and Axel's bond only grew stronger with time. They faced challenges together, rogue attacks, political intrigue, the usual complexities of ruling a supernatural territory. But they faced them as partners, as equals, as true mates in every sense of the word. Sometimes, when the northern lights danced across the sky, Riley would remember that night in the plane crash, the fear, the pain, the certainty that she was going to die alone and forgotten. She would think about the broken woman who had given birth in the wreckage, convinced that her story was ending. But it hadn't been an ending at all. It had been a beginning. The beginning of a love story that would be told around pack fires for generations to come. The tale of the Alpha King who found his true mate in the ruins of a plane crash, and the rejected Omega who became the most beloved Luna Queen in the history of the Northern Territories. Standing in her tower window, now expanded to accommodate a growing family, Riley watched her husband teaching their teenage daughter the finer points of territory negotiations. Luna was everything Marcus had claimed to want in an heir, strong, intelligent, politically astute. But she was also kind, compassionate, and fiercely protective of those she loved. She was perfect. And she was theirs. "Mama," Luna called, looking up from her lesson with eyes that held all the wisdom of her years and the promise of her future. "Papa says you're the one who taught him that love is stronger than fear. Is that true?" Riley smiled, her heart full to overflowing. "We taught each other, little moon." We saved each other. And in the golden light of the setting sun, surrounded by the laughter of her family and the warmth of a love that had conquered every obstacle, Riley Thorneheart Grayson knew that her fairy tale was complete. Not because it had a perfect beginning, it hadn't. Not because it was free from challenges, it wasn't. But because it was built on a foundation of true love, mutual respect, and the unshakable knowledge that they were stronger together than they could ever be apart. She had been rejected, abandoned, left to die in the frozen wilderness. But from that darkness had come the greatest light of her life, a love that would burn eternal, a family that would never abandon her, and a future bright with infinite possibilities. The end.